Hello and welcome to the SOFEA Sessions podcast, the place where we enable people to transform their lives through the sharing of lived experience of mental health and well-being. Today's episode features Ruth, the Director of Learning and Development at SOFEA, who has joined us to tell her story of how she adopted her 3 children. Ruth tells us about the highs and lows of the process and also shares her perspective of being the parent and the teacher of adopted children, having spent many years as a secondary school teacher. Just a reminder that the views and opinions expressed in the podcast are based on lived experience and non-clinical training and should not be considered medical advice. We are not doctors or therapists, so if you are concerned about your own health, please do contact your GP or your local mental health team. Hello Ruth.
Hello.
Welcome to the SOFEA Sessions podcast.
Thank you.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good. Thank you so much for coming on today. So can you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you've come on to talk about and why?
So I'm Ruth. I'm the Director of Learning and Development at the SOFEA charity in Didcot. And I've come on to talk about adoption, about our adoption story. And just to share the experience I think that we've had of adopting children.
Fantastic. So how did you come to adoption and how did you come to be a family of 5?
We met and got married like people do, and then after a couple of years decided that we'd like to try for children. Had no idea that might not be possible. So tried to have children for a couple of years, and then after a series of tests realised that we couldn't have children, so we went down the route of trying IVF, and after 3 years of IVF failure, we're told to take a year out and wait until we did anything else, which was incredibly frustrating. And then started to think about adoption. My mum introduced us to a very small adoption agency and said, why don't you have a look at this? And so we did. We started to think, well, maybe adoption is the route for us. And we started the whole process, I think in the August, September, and by the following July we had adopted our 3 children. So we went from 2 to 5 within a year. And it was just so different from the clinical experience of IVF, and much quicker as well in terms of getting having a family. So it's quite an interesting. So that's how we came to adopt. We did go down the route of trying to have our own children. That's what we wanted, but when that failed, then we started to think, well, what are the other options? We desperately wanted to have a family, so then we just kind of thought, well, how can we do it otherwise?
What was it like? I guess, like you say, it only took a year, which in the adoption world is quite quick, is it? What was it like having to go through that process where 1 minute it's just you and your husband and then the next, 3 children in a really short space of time?
Yeah, so it's quite an interesting thing because what happens is when you're trying for a baby, that takes time. You have to wait an awful long time before tests are done. You have to wait an awful long time then if you go for fertility treatment because there's a waiting list. And then you go through your treatments and that takes time. So probably that took about 4 or 5 years. So the waiting was horrendous. They're always waiting for something. So to then suddenly get on a process that was quite speedy, and that had a real end goal and a real kind of tangible thing that was going to happen was amazing. It is a roller coaster, and it's a very, very difficult process to go through in terms of what's going to happen at the end of it, because you've got no idea and you don't know. When you adopt children, you're given lots of possibilities, lots of scenarios. So it was really difficult, but I think once we started the adoption process, it became quite clear to us that the personal aspect of it and the human aspect of it was very much us, rather than the very clinical processes of IVF or fertility treatment. So I immediately felt much more comfortable with the whole process and thought, actually this is what I was supposed to do. Why did I go through all of that treatment when actually this feels much more like me. And I think Richard felt the same. So the process for us it wasn't a difficult process, it was a journey. And it was a journey that actually took us back over an awful lot of our lives to reinforce what we had, to be able to then make a foundation to be able to support the 3 children that we were going to have. So as a process, the interesting, I didn't enjoy IVF at all. I really enjoyed the adoption training, the adoption process. I love learning. I found out an awful lot of things about myself and about what we were about to embark on. So I think for me it was a lovely time. And then you are approved by a panel for adoption. And then you wait. And again, that's the horrible bit. So you have all this acceleration of things. But because we had said that we'd like 2 or 3 children, there are a lot of sibling families who are 3s. If you say we'll have 3, then it's probably likely you're going to get 3. So you get information on paper first, which I found very, very difficult. You can't choose, you don't choose your partner on paper, do you? And then if you say, okay, these look like children we might be able to get along with, then you have social workers come and talk to you, and then you have a meeting. We saw our children on video first, which was really sweet, but after the video I said, no, they're not for us, and Richard said, why not? And I said, I don't know. And that was a really, really difficult thing, and I think at the time I couldn't envisage any children with us, because they're children. You've got no emotional connection to them. They're somebody else's children. They don't look like you, they don't behave like you haven't grown with them. So initially, to the 3 that we eventually got, I said no and Richard said yes, and we'd agreed that if one of us said no, that was it. We both had to say yes. And I remember then being in church on the Sunday after we'd seen the video on the Friday, and I was watching all the children in church, and I just thought, why not? Why am I saying no? These are 3 lovely little children that need a family. And something just shifted, and I thought, let's try it. I went home and said, I've changed my mind. So we decided to go for the 3 that we've got.
What was it like the day that your children came home to you?
I'm going to take you one step further back there, the day that we met them. So prior to meeting your children, you go through a whole process of finding things out about them. Their foster carers start to introduce the concept of you to them. They call you the forever mummy and daddy, or forever family. Yeah. And what we did was we prepared books. So I have this thing about talking through toys. I really believe that talking through toys really helps. So I did a couple of books, photos and little stories. I used Fireman Sam and I used Bertie Bear. And they showed the children our house, they showed the children us, we had pictures of our relatives, and so we did a couple of stories. So the children were very used to pictures of us, pictures of our house, all of that kind of thing. And the day we went to meet them, they were at nursery and school. The older one was at school, and I remember them coming through the door, and one of them, we've got twins, one of the twins said, "It's Mummy and Daddy," which was bizarre. Really, really strange. The older one was much more reticent, and took a long time, just functioned in the room. I mean, it's a really, really difficult thing to do. You don't know where to put yourself. You've got social workers in the room, you've got foster carers. So, and what you do then is you live as close by or with the foster carers for a week to 10 days to gradually start taking over, and then you take them home. There's a lot of excitement around it. It's like the birth of your baby, but it's not the birth of your baby. You're taking 3 fully formed characters, and you're putting them in somewhere that they don't know. You're putting them with people that they don't know. You're all kind of surrounded by this expectation, and you have other people in the house with you, like social workers. So when they first come to you, the social worker comes with them to make sure that they're settled and they're... So none of it's normal. It's not what your normal expectation of having a family is. So what you've had to do already is really shift your whole thinking around family and around what family is going to be for you, because your family is made in a very different way. So to take your children into your house, but then to have somebody else follow you in and oversee what you're doing, yes, has to be done for safeguarding, but also is very, very strange. And I'd set the whole house up. I'd got 3 beanbags, I'd got their names on a little board, we decorated their bedrooms. My expectation was very high for these 3 children, which on reflection, you know, if I could do it again, it wouldn't have been so high, because their expectation of us was very high. I don't think they actually knew what to expect, but actually as time played out, you know, it became very tricky, and you can understand why. But I wanted a family. I had my 3 children. I was like, I had the big car, with the children on board sticker on the back. I was there, but actually I was way off, because when you adopt initially, there's no emotional connection, and I know that does happen with some people when they give birth to their children, but those children have not grown with you. They have had experiences that have impacted on them. They haven't asked to come and live with you, and yet they're being told this is your new family. They have other families, and you as parents have desperately wanted this, so we waited 5 years to have our children. So when you've got them, you think, right, this is how I want to do it. And so putting those 2 things in the mix really is really difficult. And we had some really tough times when they were very young. The older one rejected me as a mother, and I couldn't understand it. I was like, I'm your mum now. And we did have to have some extra support to enable that relationship to get better. But on reflection, why would that child have thought any different? I've got a mum, I don't need another. So that was quite interesting. One of the twins regressed massively and almost had to rebond. And again, I found that quite difficult to manage, because they're quite tall children, and she wanted to cling on to me, she wanted to be held, wanted to be carried, used to put her hands down my top and feel my boobs, really needed that baby attachment. And I was advised to go with it, you know, to the point of if she needed to be bottle fed, I had to bottle feed her, I had to spoon feed her, because she needed to relive that whole process. So that was really interesting, because as somebody who desperately wanted a baby and then didn't have a baby, I then had a 3-year-old who wanted to do baby things, and I didn't know where to go with that. And the interesting thing about, I guess, parenting, but adoption in particular maybe, is that it throws up a lot of all your own stuff. So you have an expectation of being a mum, but actually when it comes to it, it's not at all like you think it's going to be. And I really struggled. I really struggled with 3. I had 3 very different, very emotionally upset children to manage, and I found it really hard. So I did get very depressed, and that was quite difficult. And I really struggled with myself around the expectation of being a mother, and then being a mother to 3 children that really needed a mother, and then not being able to do it. So in the kind of first couple of years, it was really tough. I really struggled with it, and having 3, you know, I had one on either hand and another one hanging around my neck. I couldn't, you know, I've only got 2 knees, I've only got so many hands, and they were all vying for attention. They all very, very much needed time and attention, and I found that I couldn't give it to them all. And I think one of the ironic things is you long for so long to be called mum or mummy. I used to really envy people when I heard them say mum, mummy. And then when you've got them shouting, "Mum, Mum," you think, "Oh, what have I done?" Yeah. So
a lot of complex emotions, and like you say, I guess the children haven't been adopted. They would have been through some stuff, and at such a young age, not being able to understand those emotions that they're feeling, you trying to balance three very different people, all their complex emotions, and your own, and the wider family, I imagine, you know.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, is how do you bring adopted children into your wider family? How do those wider networks respond? And our children did struggle with behaviour. They did struggle with socialising, because they hadn't had those opportunities. They hadn't been to nursery and preschool and done all the normal things that children do to get that social interaction and to learn that behaviour. And I come from a very big family who've got lots of children, and when we used to take them home, my children used to be the ones that couldn't manage, and that's been a challenge. It's been a challenge for them, and as they've got older, it's been more of a challenge, because they do still struggle with some of those interactions. Fortunately, my parents and Richard's parents were fantastic and just embraced them as their own, which has been, it's never been an issue, so that's been lovely.
So you've touched on some of the challenges. Can you tell us some of the joys or good things about having adopted 3 children?
So the first thing I would say is they're children, and having children's great. So just bringing up children, the fun and the joy that children bring in their own discovery of the world is, I don't think you can beat that. The second thing, I think, is to watch children who have suffered then become less anxious, less distressed, and see them relax and be able to manage, and see them start to enjoy things. So our eldest really struggled to enjoy things, really struggled to laugh, to cry, to show emotion, to interact meaningfully with people, and to see that change over the years it's just lovely. And to know, I think, that you've given them that love and warmth that they didn't have. And it's, I think I'm biased, I know, but I think our family's special, and I do shy away from that, telling them they're special and that they're adopted, but we do talk a lot about what might have been. And I think one of the kind of pinnacles for me was one day when one of the twins said to me, "I wish I'd come out of your tummy." That was a really moving moment for all of us, and I said, "I wish you had." And I think at that moment we both truly wished that had happened. I wish I could have had those children from birth. I'd love to have seen them as babies. I'd love to have brought them through that. So that's interesting, isn't it? But then to see them grow. So I've got 2 children now who live independently from us, who work, who manage their lives. Those children were effectively, one of them in particular, one of the twins, we were told that things would only get harder for her and she would struggle to manage as an adult. She's not struggling. She's doing really well. So to see them grow, and to know that we're a family that's made up differently, but we're a family. Somebody said to me when I was having the IVF, I worked in a school, and the deputy head in the school was a fantastic support to me, and I went in after a failed IVF and was crying, and she said, "You will have your children." And I remember thinking at the time, I won't, I'm not gonna. And now my children are grown up. So she was right, and I've never forgotten it. She just said, "You will have your children."
How does it feel for you to reflect on, you mentioned that you were really struggling when you first got your children with your own mental health. How does it feel being able to talk now about the joys that they've had and you've had throughout your family life together?
It feels good. It feels as though everything we've been on has been a journey. and still is. And I think with the children we have, that will always be the case. We're in it together. There will always be challenges, but I feel I'm certainly much stronger now. So I'm a teacher. I love learning. I love training. I do a lot of training. After we adopted the children, I then started to do some work for the adoption agency, and I started to co-facilitate some of the training courses around being an adoptive parent, which I absolutely loved. And I was no expert, but I was able to say, this is what it's like, and this is what to look out for, and this is what not to do. And I loved that. And I also sat on the adoption panel as well, so sat on the panel that then approved parents for adoption. Brilliant. So all of those things helped me learn much more about adoption, led me down a route of becoming fascinated by attachment, trauma, and then seeing it in my own children and living it and experiencing it with them has just kind of enriched, I think, our whole lives more than I could have thought. And the work that we do at SOFEA here now probably would not be the kind of work it is had we not adopted. I think it's had a significant impact on what we do for young people in the world, because we've seen our own right in front of our very eyes.
Yeah, you've been through the whole journey, haven't you? And it's a really, obviously authentic lived experience. And you've been, well, you are the parent, you've been on the board, you've done the training, and now you're at SOFEA, and that all comes together in your practice as a parent and teacher, doesn't it? So tell us more about that, if you can, in terms of being both the parent and the teacher of adopted children.
So that's a really interesting one. So when I first started teaching, you go into teaching as you do, and you manage your class, and you see kids in there that might struggle or that can't behave, or they're the kids you chuck out. And I always was drawn to the ones that struggled. So I loved teaching the kids that couldn't sit still, that really struggle with their reading and writing. I was always drawn to those, and everybody loved me in school because I'll say, I'll have that set, I'll have that. Because I love just to get engaging and seeing the reward of the progress that some of those young people or children can make is amazing. So I loved doing that. So what I didn't know was enough about some of the traumas and things that some of those children I taught had been through. And then having flipped onto the other side and having been the parent who was being phoned by school to complain about their child was a really interesting experience for me. So I had a phone call when my eldest was 5. He threw a chair across the classroom, and the teacher phoned me, obviously, to tell me, and I was absolutely horrified. I was like, my child has done that, kind of no child of mine would ever do anything like that. And I'm the teacher, and I phone parents and tell them things like that. So it was quite interesting. But I think I'm quite passionate now about what it's like to be the teacher and the parent. And I think I'd like to work with teachers more around the experience of the parent, not just the experience of the child. So parents that have children who struggle themselves, and how to deal with parents who are struggling it's quite a skill. And I think had I understood a little bit more around some of that, I might have dealt with some of those parents a bit easier, or I might have kind of said, this is really tough for you, rather than your child is this, your child is that, your child is the other. I was the parent at the school gates that was terrified of the teacher walking towards me because I knew that one of mine had done such and such. I was the parent that had the teacher phoning me and saying, we're going to have to do this, that and the other. To be on the other side of that is quite hard. And there is a little bit of shame in that, and that's no disrespect to my children whatsoever. It's just how, I think particularly having been the teacher as well and then flipping it the other way, it's quite hard. And I think just knowing some of the stuff my children went through before they came to us. I once saw a teacher say to a child, and we do this all the time, teachers just look at me when I'm talking to you. And I knew for that child that had been a real trigger in the past around abuse.
Wow.
But we're not aware of those things. We're not taught to look for those things or taught to be careful of saying those things, and that's where I'd like some more training and information around that. So yeah, it's an interesting one.
Yeah. I think that because you've got such an empathetic approach for parents, because you've kind of been in that situation, I feel like that, you said a minute ago, they just need someone to say, I know you're struggling, I know this is really hard for you. And I think, I'm a practitioner, and I find sometimes having conversations with parents quite difficult, because I'm conscious of unintentionally evoking blame. So how can you have a really honest conversation with a parent without them feeling patronised, like you're trying to blame them, and have that more I'm here for you as well as your child approach?
I think one of the most useful, or one of the best questions you can ask a parent when they come to you is, how are you? And that very rarely happens, because people dive straight in with the problem, which is the child. And I've done it myself. I'm not saying I'm perfect in that respect. I'm not at all, and I know I've done that myself. And then I remember being in the office with the head teacher at the primary school with my children, and she said, how are you? And that just opened the floodgates. And in fact, the best thing she did was introduce me to another adoptive mother, who is my best friend now.
Oh, wow.
And we've brought our adopted children up together very closely, and been through all kinds of things together. But yeah, that support has been amazing.
Just being able to connect with someone who understands.
Yeah, and being able to say, I can say this to you because I know you'll get it, and not always feeling that you can say that. People say to you, if you tell them you've adopted, they'll say, oh, you're so brave. And I don't like being told I'm brave, because I wasn't brave. My children were brave, I think. I think they're the ones that need to be told they're brave, because they got on with it. They moved counties, they moved schools, they moved families, they've accepted us, and they've also had to manage what happened to them. We weren't brave, we wanted a family, and we did what we could to have that family. And people tend to have the view that you adopt because you want to either save the world or something like that. They don't always, but that's possibly something that happens. But we weren't brave. We had our family.
So thinking about, I guess, your whole lived experience of adoption, and everything you've talked about so far, do you have any tips or advice for parents who have adopted children, and then secondly, who are considering adoption?
So considering adoption, we'll look at that one first. Take your time, most definitely, and where you can, talk to other people who've adopted. Adoption is not easy. You are taking on children who have had traumatic experiences, who bring other parts of their lives with them. So you need to have your eyes open. And that in itself is quite interesting, because when you desperately want children, sometimes you can be blinkered around that. And that might be a good thing in a way, because otherwise nobody marries at all. So definitely to take your time, and to get as much information as you can. And if your gut instinct says no, say no. Because these are lives that we're dealing with. These are children's lives, and children's lives who've already had a lot of rejection, a lot of trauma, a lot of loss. So yeah, I think I would say, if you can, then get as much information and talk to as many people as you can, and don't rush. For people who have adopted already, I would say try to get as educated as you can around attachment, trauma, loss. Understand about different attachment styles. So I had one of my twins who, as I said, attached overly, wouldn't leave me alone, almost suffocated me one who was very cold and ambivalent, didn't really care whether you hugged them or not, or cared for them or not. And another one who was very chaotic, so sometimes smothered you, sometimes didn't. I had no idea about those kinds of attachments. I've been brought up in a lovely family where everybody just loved each other and got on with it. I had no clue that those things even existed, and therefore didn't understand the behaviour I was seeing in my own house because it was alien to me. I had assumed that everybody connected in a certain way. So really getting some understanding of that, and looking then at what's causing the behaviours that you're seeing in front of you, which isn't always easy, and that goes back to my point about your own expectations as a parent. So as a newly adopted mother, I had done their bedrooms out in Next bedding and wallpaper. It was the days of borders, and I used to lie there before the children came and think, you know, they'll be in those 2 bedrooms, and I'll read them stories and tuck them into bed. None of that happened. They raged and screamed when it came to bedtime. They pulled the borders off the wall. The eldest one ripped the curtains down. I bought them all a lovely toy that they were going to keep forever. One of the twins destroyed the toy within days, and I was shell-shocked, absolutely shell-shocked, because we spent hours and hours trying to get them to bed, all of that, which on reflection is completely understandable, but nobody really tells you that's going to happen. You just think you've got these 3 gorgeous little beings, and you think, right, it's going to be bath, story, bed, because that's what you do when you have a child. And then when you've got children who've never been read to, who've never had routine, who's, you know, why would that work?
It's almost like starting fresh. You've got to rebuild all their expectations of what happens at what point in the day. And
I think one big mistake that we made was, and this was actually on the advice of the social worker, but I disagree with it now, was that they didn't have any more contact with their foster carers. So they moved to us. That was it. New life, forever family. And one of the twins really struggled to get to sleep at night, screamed, cried. And one day I just thought, I'm going to get some pictures out of the foster carers, because we've taken this child from one life to another. And as soon as she saw those pictures and we talked through who they were and that they were still there, she said, where are they? And we thought, oh my goodness, this 3-year-old thinks that they've gone. She didn't know what had happened to them, and we weren't aware enough or experienced enough to be able to talk that through, to kind of go, you know, this is where you are now, but it's a transition, you will miss them, because we hadn't got the knowledge or the experience. We let that child have the time to look at those photos when she wanted, which helped.
Yeah, that honesty and allowing them to have the answers.
Yeah, and not denying anything that's happened to them or anybody that's been in their past. And I think for adoptive parents, acknowledging that they have got a mother and a father and siblings, even if you're not in contact with them, that is part of their lives. They have a right to that, and that can be very difficult for parents who want to be the parent and want their own children. You have to actually go, I'm sorry, but your children have got other families, and we've always been, in our house, we've always been very open about that. We have 2 mums. We have an old mum and a new mum. And I will never ever deny to my children the fact that they've got, you know, we've had lots of conversations about what might happen if they did meet their birth mum again, and what they might call her, and I'm very open to that kind of conversation. And we joke about it almost now, because we're at that point where we can talk about it very openly. So I'd say openness, definitely openness as well. If they want to talk about something, let them talk about it. I've always preempted as well, not being able to say, you're not my mum, you're not my dad. I've just said, don't say that to me, because I'm not. So you won't get anywhere, or you won't upset me by saying you're not my birth mum or you're not my real mum, because no, I'm not. But I am the mum that you've got. So we've always had that kind of approach, and they've never turned around to me and said, you're not my real mum, because I got in there first. But I think there is a bit of preempting. So is there putting yourself in their shoes and thinking, what does that feel like? They will be cross with you. They will resent you because you're not their real parent. They're their birth parent. They will feel guilty about their birth parents. They will wonder whether they're okay. They will want to know. And they will feel a profound sense of rejection that probably will never leave them. And you can do a lot to heal that and to help them then become healthy, productive adults. But you can't take it away.
No. But it sounds like that guided exploration that you've allowed yourself to go on, but also your children, allowing them such a safe place to ask those questions. Children, and I guess people in general, are so curious, aren't they?
Yeah.
And like you say, it's a real right to be able to ask questions and have someone who is willing to give you that time and space, particularly, like you say, for lots of adopted children who didn't have that when they were young.
I think it's really important, and I'm quite passionate about the fact that they have that, and that can be difficult because birth families can be, not always. Obviously, those children have been taken into care, so. But I think it's about preserving their dignity in that, and allowing them to acknowledge that is their family. It's where they came from.
So I'm going to finish with a bit of a question for you. If you could go back to your younger self when your children first arrived at your home, what would you tell yourself?
I'd definitely tell myself to relax. I would tell myself that it didn't matter if we got through a day where we didn't brush our hair and stayed in our pyjamas all day. And I would tell myself to lower my expectations, because I think expectation is a big factor in terms of what happens in your life, and where you take children, just to accept them as they are to start with. And I'd like to think that I did do that, but on reflection there was so much of me caught up in wanting to be that perfect parent that I probably put too much expectation on them, and myself, which goes back to Donald Winnicott's theory of good enough parenting. The health visitor said to me, what you are doing is good enough. But because I was clothing them, feeding them, providing them with a safe, secure environment, but to me it wasn't good enough. So it was interesting. But that emotional connection, the other thing I would say to myself is, don't expect to love them straight away, and don't expect them to love you. At what point with an adopted child do you start to say I love you? How do you know if you love them? How do you know if they love you? How do they know? One of my twins still says nowadays, I don't think I know what love is, I'm not sure, and has asked us to explain love and what it feels like, because she can't access that feeling. And I think one of the things that I come back to quite often is, I don't know what it feels like to love my own child. So how do I know? Is this a different love I have? I love my children, but is it a different love? Yeah. Is it not? And it's something that I puzzle about sometimes. And people try to answer that question for me, but nobody can answer that question for me. That's going to have to just be one of my unknowns. And I think the other thing I would tell myself would just be to embrace it for what it is. Just take your foot off the pedal a bit.
Because I guess there's only so much you can have control or influence over, right?
I definitely would. If I were to go back, I would step back and observe more rather than act. And one of the things I love to do most as a teacher is to observe, but as a parent it was a whole different experience. So I certainly would say, just step back a little bit and watch what's happening rather than try to get into that role so quickly and get on with it, which is what I did.
I think those questions that you're asking are great though. What is causing this behaviour? What might have happened to make them feel this or do this, and why am I reacting? So I think that's a real skill when you're going through such complex up and down emotions, then be able to step back, observe and go, oh, actually, what's going on with me? What's this bringing up of my stuff? And that's a skill to be learned, isn't it?
I've got 2 parents in the equation there as well, so parenting styles, attachment. So the eldest didn't attach to me but attached to Richard much more quickly. That made me feel very jealous. So then, you've got another layer kind of coming in, and it's hard work.
Yeah, there's lots to unpack, isn't there? We could probably do a part 2.
Yeah, we could. Oh, we could.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure to talk to you and hear your story, and I can imagine that so many people listening, even if it's just a message to your younger self, that they can then take back and think, I can relate to that. I think that's the power of listening to other people's stories, is knowing that you don't have to be alone in those feelings, and like you say, those things that you can't always tell everybody, the things that you're afraid to say. So I'm sure that people listening will have been interested to hear what you have to say, but also hopefully find some comfort if they are going through this journey. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
A massive thank you to Ruth for coming on to the podcast today and sharing her story. If you're affected by anything that you heard in today's episode, there are some organisations that can offer support below. Or alternatively, if you have any questions or would like to get in touch, you can email us at wellbeing@sofea.uk.com. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and watch this space for next month's episode.